Horror films are fascinating. Horror films are utterly fascinating. The very best ones, deliberately or subconsciously, they expose modern anxieties, the modern anxieties of their time, which makes them relevant. They find the cultural symptoms of fear, the pervading idea of fear, and they expose it so that at least culturally we can identify it, if not completely cleanse ourselves of it. But really it's about punishing ourselves for being so afraid of that particular thing that we do not understand. The slasher genre is no different. The slasher genre used to be just as powerful. I'm making this video because I just watched Halloween 2018, or I should say I watched 75% of Halloween, and I had to turn it off out of frustration and anger. I just could not, it was so irrelevant. It's not that it was a poorly made film, it was just a disastrously irrelevant one that seemed to infantilize fear, that seemed to try to keep fear within arrested development. And I'll get into that in a second, but let's try to place the slasher genre within its correct context, because we could see this going all the way back. I love looking at different decades of horror. I love looking at different signifiers of horror. It truly is a wonderful lens to actually understand the culture of the time, cinematically, psychologically, and emotionally, viscerally, because these are horror films that we're talking about. So when they're showing us what we are afraid of the most, by proxy or by virtue of being horror films, these are the most kind of visceral experiences and the most unforgivable ones as well, the most guttural, the most macabre. We go all the way back to Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney's appearance, his disfigured appearance, in most of his roles. Not only The Penalty, but I think most importantly, The Phantom of the Opera. What that truly represented, at least on a subconscious level, on an analytical and metaphorical one, were the soldiers coming home from World War I, who were brutalized, who were disfigured, and it punishes the audience because the entire fear around it is that I don't recognize that as a part of my normal society. I can't place that within the normalcy that I accept to be my reality. And we can even move forward a bit more modern, right? Let's go to the 60s. The 60s were pretty incredible because it was mostly about women who are trying to just be individuals, be independent, but they are being overruled. They're being run by these actually demonic men. I think Roman Polanski probably did this the best in the 60s with Repulsion in 65 and Rosemary's Baby in 68 or 66, I'm not entirely sure, don't exactly remember, but that's when they were at their best. And Rosemary's Baby is just a wonderful a wonderful metaphor for a woman's right to choose, and all the men around her are trying to make every decision for her, and so are her female neighbors as well. They're trying to control her femininity into very defined dimensions, Christian dimensions, Americanized dimensions. Repulsion is incredible because it's about that POV, right? It's about making you feel like an invader, that you're invading on Catherine Deneuve, who starred in that film. You're invading on her virginal qualities. You're invading on her innocence. You're invading on her privacy, her secrecy, and both Polanski and Deneuve punish you for your affection, which is unwanted and completely without an actual emotional core. You have a very visceral attraction to her, and they are punishing you for trying to control her within your erotic imagination. When we get to the end of the 60s, we have the emergence of Romero's zombie films, which are incredibly transformative. Night of the Living Dead being about that mob mentality and about racism. Dawn of the Dead, which is a masterful film, a masterpiece, which is, of course, anti-consumerist. Romero's zombie films are mostly spectacular, and that's probably because they're incredibly transformative, and they really try to focus in on the modern anxieties of their day, and without any sort of value judgment, without any sort of absolute moralistic lens, just portray it in grim Gothica. And at that same time, we are getting both the resurgence of, we are getting the implementation of slasher genres and the resurgence, a resurgence of vampires. So with the vampires, we are getting late 70s and all through the 80s, the vampires, unlike Bela Lugosi's in Todd Browning's Dracula, who was a signifier of xenophobia, right? The original Dracula film was all about fear of the foreigner coming over and ravaging your women and taking advantage of of your country's valuables, mostly being women, mostly for sexual impulse and purpose. In the 80s, our vampires are far more androgynous, they are far more romantic, they are incredibly attractive, yet there is something deliberately alternative to their lifestyle. The queer texturing should be very obvious with these kinds of pictures, especially considering queer filmmakers like Joel Schumacher made some of the best examples of these. There's something wrong with our blood. And there's something terribly fatal about the way we choose to express our love to those we are devoted to. And that is a complete analogy for the AIDS epidemic as it was coming to be known. So the vampire resurgence, I think, effortlessly mirrored the AIDS crisis in America. And at the same time, you're getting slasher films. And slasher films, unlike they are today, used to be incredibly relevant. Because slasher films focus their horror in a familiarity, in hyper-familiarity, in suburbia, right? And slasher films also took incredible strides with subjective camera shots, mostly with POVs. And the slasher genre's primary audience were adolescent teen boys, and the heroes of these films were mostly resourceful, virginal young women, the final girls. So adolescent boys being subjected to these POV shots are subconsciously, they don't know this, but they are identifying with the killer himself. So, and since the killers also, they most often, like Michael Myers, use commonly found tools to kill their prey, to stalk their prey with. Of course, with Michael Myers, it's a butcher knife, same with Norman Bates. And anyone could use a knife. Everyone's used a knife. Everyone knows what it feels like, tactile, in their hand. Everyone knows that physical sensation. Everyone knows the physicality of pretending to stab something, or actually stabbing something. And by incorporating something like that, something that you know how to feel, with something a little bit more alien, like the POV shots of pure evil, like we could find in 78's Halloween, or even 74's Black Christmas, and I believe Psycho to a certain extent. Adolescent boys are being put into the position of a killer. Now, what gets really interesting, too, is that I think there were a lot of remarkable strides within horror, within the slasher films, but horror overall, I believe, is a very conservative kind of film. I think conservatism is, inherently scary, but let's not dive too far down that road. But slasher films are extremely moralistic. Alright? Extremely moralistic. These kids know that they will be killed if they smoke, if they have sex, or, they weren't self-aware of it until Scream, and we'll get there in a minute. But during that time period, after seeing enough of these films, the audience knew, oh, you will die if you have sex, you will die if you do drugs, you will die if you do this or that certain kind of signifier or staple, and you will definitely be marked for death eventually. But at the same time, you also know that the absolute boogeyman will be killed by the absolute symbol of good. So, all throughout the film, evil punishes evil. And then ultimately, absolute evil is punished and defeated, vanquished, by virginal and resourceful good. And that's an extremely moralistic thing. It is teaching kids that, or at least trying to tell them, I don't know how well they listened, that virginal qualities are to be applauded. And it takes a certain kind of maybe religious resourcefulness, aptitude to kind of defeat true evil in the end. And the slasher genre was transformative over the years. It did kind of tackle different things, which is why it lasted, I think, in relevancy from, 20 years? 30 years, yeah. I believe it lasted in relevancy from from at least 78 with Halloween all the way to 96 with Scream 1. Because I think Scream 1 put that nail in the coffin. Scream 1 is an anti-horror film, and I think it's a brilliant anti-horror film. I think the point of the film was to poison the well. Almost like Watchmen, if you read that as a superhero comic book, there doesn't need to be any superhero comic book after that, because it definitively killed the ideal of the superhero. And I believe Scream, absolutely, completely, wholly killed the ideal of the slasher, every relevant thing about the slasher film. And it did bring its own innovations in as well. It is slightly transformative. I believe it's amazing how that film was able to foreshadow the mentality of the Columbine killers and of the spoiled and dispossessed and alienated and like completely psychotic white male school shooters ahead of time. I mean, because that film posited that you don't have to be afraid of a boogeyman. No matter how human that boogeyman is, you know this person. It is your boyfriend who you gave your body to and his dumb fuck drooling best friend played by Matthew Lillard. Scream, I think, is an incredible postmodern film, a deconstructionist masterpiece, and one of the greatest horror movies of all time, even though it is a complete anti-horror film, because it does reflect the culture of its time. The 90s were a deconstructionist decade, whether we're looking at with music, like with shoegaze and the emergence of hip-hop being essentially postmodern deconstructionist subgenres of music, or with books, and with television, with art itself. The 90s were obsessed with deconstruction, and Scream is an absolute essential deconstructionist American masterpiece, seconded only by probably Pulp Fiction. Scream is legitimately brilliant. But Scream, in one final stroke, made the slasher genre irrelevant. Irrelevant. And what happens when you don't move forward from that? Well, what happens is the slasher genre just becomes infantilized. It just becomes kind of desperate. Because we did technically move on from that, because after that, after Scream, of course, you got like the Blair Witch Project in '99, soon to be followed by the Saw and the Hostel movies, so we had the torture porn and found footage movement gaining momentum and having these wildly different trajectories, but wildly important and culturally significant ones, respectively. Of course, I go into it in other videos about why these are so important. I think that found footage films are extremely important signifiers of how youth started to view their own lives cinematically, as in through a camera, and torture porn reflects really the internet becoming the internet, and some of the first beheading, gross-out videos that you saw on the internet were typically grainy, were typically torture porn, and typically of found footage. So you can even make the argument that torture porn, even if it's not a found footage film, is derived from found footage, that these things kind of branch off of it. And the slasher genre also kept on its way in a very desperate fashion. Now, I do like 2011's Scream 4. I do like it. It's an anti-horror film. There is nothing about that film that seeks to be legitimate. In fact, I believe the point of that film is, we killed this genre. We gutted this genre with a hunting knife 20 years ago. Why is this still happening? Why are we still doing this? This film will expose to you the complete emptiness of what you're doing. The end result of beating a dead horse to death is that the dead horse starts to rot. It just reeks of desperation, but at least in Scream 4 it's a self-aware desperation, and that's what I give Scream 4. I think Scream 4 is also a rather brilliant film in its own right. Even though it doesn't work, I think, on a compositional or conceptual scale, I think that's the point of it. I think slasher films can't work anymore. They don't address modern anxieties. And about the infantilization, because now we're getting to remakes of Nightmare on Elm Street. Rob Zombie's version of Halloween, which is just miserable beyond belief. Texas Chainsaw Massacre remakes all through the 2000s. Like, this is just absurdity. And what it does is it doesn't transform these boogeymen into identifiable symbols and icons of modern fears and anxieties. It does not transform them or modernize them, because they really can't be transformed or modernized. We have moved beyond that fear. What it is doing is infantilizing the people who are watching it, keeping them into that stasis. And that stasis is not one of fear, it is one of comfort. When something scary starts to comfort you, then it no longer has the power, the distinguished power, or any truly definable virtuous characteristic. It just becomes disposable. It just becomes recycled garbage until we get all the way to like Blumhouse making this Halloween film. If there are horror films today that are tackling a modern fear, it appears that the modern fear and modern anxiety is the complete dissolution of concepts of the American family. We can get this literally with films like 2015's The Invitation or Hereditary, or a bit more metaphorically like the American family, the characteristic of the shared American family, with Jordan Peele's work more recently. That seems to be what most people are responding to, and what seemed to affect people with a kind of artistry. And then we get films like Halloween, and these awful slasher films. Side note, I think Terrifier is great because it's a Splatterhouse movie that knows it's stupid, but also knows that it's not supposed to be completely scary, it's supposed to make you sick to your stomach, and Terrifier absolutely does. Looking forward to Terrifier 2. It doesn't treat a cultural symptom. If it does, if you want to step back kind of meta-contextually and go, why do I enjoy watching this? There's something wrong with me. I'm desensitized, and this is the only thing that I can get my rocks off to in a horror film kind of way. We can go into that later, but Terrifier is fine. But every other slasher film that I tend to see completely misses the point, and I don't even think identifies that it's irrelevant outside of Scream 4. Scream 4 is like, this is irrelevant fucking shit. What we're doing here is childish. What we're doing here is keeping the world infantilized, keeping the world in stasis. We are teaching them now how to be comforted by the idea that they are the killer. We are teaching adolescent boys, or like, probably more accurately, the target audience for these films were the adolescent boys who grew up watching these movies in the 90s, the early 2000s, 80s, and 70s. Those are probably the actual target audience, so that's what I mean by keeping them in a state of arrested development. Because these are full-grown males who aren't confronting what they're actually afraid of anymore. That's what makes it irrelevant. I'm not saying a film has to scare you to death. I'm saying that a film does have a sort of social responsibility. That horror films have, I think, signed a social contract to make everyone on the planet completely scared. Completely, at least ashamed. If not scared, then ashamed. I don't want to walk away from a horror movie without feeling scared, ashamed, or dispossessed of a certain essential element of myself. I don't want to leave a horror movie without those kinds of feelings. Watching Halloween 2018, Michael Myers needs to die. Leatherface needs to die. Freddy Krueger needs to die. Gotta say though, love 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, one of my favorite slasher films ever made. I love that Wes Craven, one of the ones who really solidified the slasher genre as this popular means of expression, later killed it in Scream, and then I think dug up the corpse and pissed on it in Scream 4 in a genius, wonderfully brilliant kind of way. Let's all love Wes Craven. But his creation, Freddy Krueger, needs to die, and I think he knew that. Freddy Krueger needs to die, Michael Myers needs to die, Jason Voorhees needs to die. They all need to go away. Because they're irrelevant. Because they have more in common with Marvel superheroes now than they do with actual film villains. Because they have more lore and more fans than someone like Ant-Man. Because they have more in common with Batman than with an actual signifier of doom, with an actual presence of evil, of an ineffable evil that you don't quite understand yet feel so familiar at the exact same time. They need to go away because they aren't serving their purpose anymore. Their purpose is being redefined, and their purpose is redefined as it's all just consumerism. It's all just keeping you away from really identifying what scares you right now and what scares us collectively as a culture, as the American culture, or maybe as a global culture, all at once, simultaneously. What they are doing is keeping you in a stasis of apathy, of childlike apathy and rebellion. But rebellion without purpose, rebellion without end, manufactured rebellion. Slasher films are a joke. And what they need to do is die, and they need to die immediately. Because they are pointless, they are horrible, they are stupid. A lot of horror fans are very childish when it comes to these kinds of sentiments. Kill the slasher genre. Nostalgia is not a viable form of art. Get rid of it. My name's Zachary Conan. I hope you enjoyed this video. Oh my gosh. It was a bit longer than I anticipated. Michael Myers needs to die. And all other kinds, all other archetypes, all other slasher boogeymen need to die and be forgotten. They're impeding film criticism, they're impeding the horror film in general, and they're kind of, to be quite frank, they're insulting to me. Not only my intelligence, but my emotional intelligence as well. They are insultingly irrelevant. In the comments, tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why I'm right. Tell me why you don't care. And subscribe to the channel. Like the video. Please like the video, actually. Liking it helps so much. I don't think you have any idea how much liking and commenting help, because it's like, it signals to YouTube that there's an engagement being happened with my audience, like going on, happening dynamically. So do that. My name is Zachary Conan. Thank you so much for watching this video and putting up with it. It may have been slightly incoherent, but I really do think I articulated myself fine in this video. Thank you so much for watching it. Long live horror. I do love horror.